my proposed alternative solution would be rolling back a lot of this red tape to allow people to employ their own skills and own capital in ways that they see fit to try to improve their own lives.
Hello. Welcome again to the episode in the Let People Prosper show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to bring on someone who has written a book, someone who is a young voice in America, and someone who knows a lot about different types of policies and what it means to you across America. And it's none other than Ben Ayanian. Ben, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Vance, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on. You've got a good book that is called Beyond Intention: How Progressive Economic Policy Initiatives Will Harm Society's Most Vulnerable. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. But before we get to all that, let me go ahead and read your bio for the audience, and then we'll jump right into it. So, Ben Ayanian is a graduate of the University of Minnesota, where he studied philosophy, business law, and political science. He is a widely published commentator, having written pieces in the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, Newsweek, and more. And he is also the author of this book, Beyond Intention. He's currently attending law school this fall. So, with all that going on, Ben, I'm going to go ahead and ask you the first question I do all the guests. Why do you do what you do every day?
I love that question. And I absolutely love what I do in terms of political and economic and also social commentary. I think that there's a lot of important issues out there in the ether, and it's easy to get lost in all of the noise, right? There's so many issues. The government itself is so big. And as a result of just that simple fact, there are tons of stories in the news, tons of policies that are being floated around constantly. And it's really hard for everyday Americans who have lives, have families, kids, jobs, to really put all the time and energy into keeping track of it all. And I think as a result, some of the most important issues, ones that actually affect individuals' day-to-day lives, really slip through the cracks. And instead are replaced by the more contentious issues, ones that might not be, I don't want to say that they're unimportant compared to the ones I have in mind, but they maybe shouldn't be at the top of our docket. So I really love tracking what at least I feel are the most important policy discussions, the most important, news issues coming out of Washington, D.C., state and local governments. And I love writing about them. Everybody does have an opinion, right?
Yeah.
I certainly have plenty. That's why I write op-eds. That's why I wrote a book. And I love doing it because there are issues that, it actually speaks to the title of your show, that affect people's ability to prosper. Now, we all have individual agency to a certain degree. We all can do in our own little sphere, do what we can to push our lives forward in certain ways, whether it's personal, familial, or even professional, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there are forces that are somewhat out of our control. That's just a fact of life. There are forces in our control. There are forces out of our control. And some of the ones that can be out of our control are the policies that people we either didn't vote for, or even people that we did vote for, implementing policies we don't agree with, or that even if we agree with, we might not be aware, negatively affect our lives.
Yeah.
And so I love writing about these issues. I love the intellectual exercise, the conversations, and the light bulb that goes off in my head and people's heads when I'm talking to them about these various issues.
Yeah, I love it. And you've already written a lot, and you're working on a lot of these things. You're still early on in your career, which is fantastic. I wonder what got you into this passion. Was it something from your parents, something that you started on your own? How did you get part of this journey?
It was not actually from my parents. I grew up in a household that didn't talk politics very often.
Same here.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And then, I actually want to ask real quick, what was the main thing that drove you into this world?
Yeah, I think it was growing up kind of in poverty, low single mother household, with just me and my sister. And so I saw the problems that affected people. And then got me into economics was a mentor I had in college at Texas Tech University, where he handed me Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom and was like, hey, you should read this. And I was hooked. And then kind of the rest was history after that. But really it was from my upbringing and seeing what happened to people. I really wanted to help people prosper.
That's awesome. So there are some parallels in our story, but also a lot of differences, and we still ended up in somewhat of a similar place in terms of our interests in our day-to-day lives. So Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom was a huge inflection point for me. But my upbringing wasn't necessarily conducive to me being super interested in these issues. I really wasn't interested in these issues at all. In high school, I really only cared about basketball, right?
Yeah.
I was an athlete in high school. And then
are you pretty tall? I can't tell how tall you are, but are you pretty tall?
I'm just under 6 foot.
Okay.
So I was a guard.
Yeah.
I played basketball my whole life. Was one of the shorter players on the court for sure.
But you had some good ball. You had good ball control then, all right?
Exactly.
Yeah, good.
I was shifty.
I'm 6'4". I'm 6'4", so I'm a little taller, but I didn't have the ball control that I needed at that sort of level.
Or maybe you could hit those 3-pointers on the wing. Then we'd make a good combination.
There you go.
So in high school, I really wasn't super into these issues. When I got to undergrad, I would say that I was a bit agnostic on my political positions. I really did not know a lot about politics.
Yeah.
My classes freshman year were very left-leaning, left-centric. Like the leftist professors. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
And I remember I was actually texting my dad during some of these courses saying, "Oh my God, Dad, I learned this today. Like, this is crazy. We got to do something about it." And he's like, "Whoa. Like, just take a step back." And he's like, try do your own research on these issues, and really try and think about them instead of just digesting maybe what the first professor is telling you, right? So I did that. I was that close, right, to becoming somewhat of a leftist, sympathetic individual because of my professors. I did my own research. As a result of that, I became, for a moment, just a small moment, a little bit of like a red-blooded Republican as a revolt against. There's different spectrums of any political party. I was full-blown like Trump Republican in a sense for a small moment because I was revolting against my professors. Mm-hmm. I then
you had a rebellious nature about you, Ben.
I did. Yeah, I'm sure my parents would say the same thing. So I continued that rebellious nature, but I just kept reading and reading. I read Milton Friedman, and then I got into people like Robert Nozick, Thomas Sowell, and as Murray Rothbard as well. I now have become a libertarian. Anyone, a small L libertarian, I would say. I never pin myself to a party. Anyone who reads my Twitter knows that, or my articles, I criticize Republicans, I criticize Democrats. Personally, I don't love either of our presidential candidates. So I've become this almost politically homeless, very small government-oriented individual. And in college, I wrote an article with a friend called... you know what? Honestly, I'm forgetting the title of it, but it was in the Star Tribune. A friend supported me in writing this article. I would say I was the author of it, but a friend who was interested supported me in it. And at the time at Minnesota, we had riots, we had COVID. There was a lot going on here, and the leadership of our university at the time, the University of Minnesota, I felt was employing some very irresponsible rhetoric. So as a student, I decided to write an op-ed. It was published in the Star Tribune, which is the largest paper in Minnesota. It's one of the largest newspapers in the country. And after that, I just kind of caught the itch of, man, I really like public commentary. I saw the effect that it had on people. And so a mentor of mine, he's an economist from George Mason named Professor Betke.
Peter Betke. He's been a guest on the show, and he's one of my favorite economists. So I love Pete.
Pete is great. Absolutely love Pete. And he was the one who told me I should think about joining Young Voices. I did. And so I'd be happy to give a little background about Young Voices, but I know I just rambled a little bit there.
No, this is great. I love all that background too, because I think it's important, to know where people are coming from, how they got to the level they're at today, and everything else. It's really important. But I did want to hear more about Young Voices, though, because I think some in the audience may be interested in this. That really is helping a lot of people. I mean, I've known a lot of people that have went through the program. I didn't go through it myself, but I know a lot of people that have been affiliated with it, and they've loved it. So I'd love to hear your perspective on it.
Yeah, Young Voices is a nonprofit organization that helps support heterodox thinkers, right? So you could be You could be as conservative as they come, and you could probably find a place for yourself in Young Voices. You could be as libertarian as they come, and you could probably find yourself in Young Voices. The only, individuals, there's typically not, leftist individuals in Young Voices. There's Young Voices takes a very strong pro-liberty stance. And so, there's a spectrum, obviously there. So Young Voices supports individuals like myself and others who want to commentate on various political issues. They help edit your op-eds. They help you figure out where you should pitch your op-eds. They help you get booked on great shows like this one. I've been on Fox 5 DC. I've been on cable news networks, really as a result of Young Voices. And actually, one of the editors at Young Voices joined my book project and edited my book for me.
Awesome. No, that's exciting, and I'm glad that you got affiliated with them, and thank you for explaining a little more about them. I'll make sure to put a link in the show notes page as well to their work, because it really is important for Young Voices, for young people to really have a voice in what's going on. And, you're starting a lot earlier than I did on having the discussion and writing commentaries and everything else. I actually got more into this through IHS, Institute for Humane Studies. Their Koch Summer Fellowship is what got me going back in. I did Scholarship in a Free Society, one of their weekend seminars they did. And that's where I met like Pete Boettke, Steve Horowitz, and Mark Pennington, whole bunch of great people that I had never heard of in Austrian School of Economics. And I really got kind of enthralled with them and really kept learning more about it. And so it's great they were able to meet these people and the networking they were able to do. So I'm glad to have you on the program and for us to discuss a lot of these things. As we're heating up into this election season, and this will be released, in October. I'm wondering what some of your thoughts are. Before we get into the book, I want to get into a lot of that, okay? But I wonder what some of your thoughts are. Being in Minnesota for a while now, you've seen the Governor Walz, the new VP candidate for Harris on the Democrat ticket. And you said you're not really interested in either one of them per se. And I should say, like, I'm a classical liberal. I'm a lowercase libertarian as well. I have a lot of issues with both of them. I did work in the Trump administration for a year as the chief economist for Office of Management and Budget. But it was more about, serving America and trying to do the best that I could given the situation that I was in. And it was tough. I had to push back with a lot of protectionism, a lot of failed immigration policies. But there was deregulation. There were some tax cuts. There were some things that I could help support. But I'm really concerned about this current election cycle. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, about what you've seen in Minnesota, but also just in general, whatever you'd like to share. I'd love to get your thoughts on this, Ben.
Yeah, in terms of the election itself, so I could start from the Democrat side because Tim Walz is the governor of the state I currently reside in.
Right.
He was also governor of the state when I was an undergrad here. So I was here during, COVID. George Floyd happened, the George Floyd riots. I was actually home when all of that was happening.
Okay.
We've been sent home for COVID, and it was summer break, I believe, at the time as well.
Yeah.
So I wasn't actually in Minnesota when it was all going down, but I was tracking it, and I lived the aftermath of it. Tim Walz, I personally can't understand or fathom why anyone would look at Tim Walz after his record in office in Minnesota and think that he is a competent individual in terms of governance, in terms of policy. He waited too long to try and clamp down when this city, in a sense, was on fire.
Yeah.
Those fiery but mostly peaceful protests. Everyone knows.
Yeah.
That headline from CNN.
Quite literally on fire in many places, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, there was wreckage in this city and this greater metropolitan area through my graduation, which was in 2022, right? Man. So that was years after at that point. And in terms of COVID, he tried to incentivize Minnesotans to call government hotlines to tattle on their neighbors who they didn't feel were following guidelines. He implemented strict mandates of various types. He absolutely ruined job growth and creation. I mean, this city is not, Minneapolis is not the same city it was that I came to in 2018 as a freshman at the University of Minnesota.
Yeah.
There are very few businesses. It's not as densely populated. It's a lot more unsafe. I will actually say the the first weekend I was back here getting ready, to go to law school, I almost got jumped at 10:50 a.m. in the middle of the city.
Oh, man.
There was no one around. I had not run that fast in a while. I'm glad to see I still got it a little bit. A lesser athlete might have had a little bit more trouble. But it was a really scary situation.
Wow.
And that I would have never thought about that happening 10:50 a.m. on a Saturday in the center area of the city. Wouldn't have happened 4, 5, 6 years ago. So Governor Walz has driven business out of here. Actually, Kevin O'Leary, who people know as Mr. Wonderful Shark Tank, was on Fox Business recently, and he gave a great rant about how Tim Walz is a great governor for every other state in the country other than Minnesota, because he's driving jobs abroad.
Yeah.
Now, so that's a massive problem. Kamala Harris is a well-known leftist. She ran a very far left campaign in 2020. She's trying to walk back some of those issues, but she still holds certain values that are going to be conducive to leftist policies, like being a proponent of equality of outcome as opposed to equality of opportunity.
Right.
That's very concerning. On the right, I don't. People can try and split hairs and figure out if I respect people of all political, walks. I have friends who are very far on the left. I have friends who are very far on the right. Totally respectful of that. Personally, on the right, I don't see a lot more to be that excited about. With Trump's protectionist policies, I'm very concerned about his idea to put a 10% blanket tariff on imports. That would be detrimental to the economy, to jobs, to our prosperity.
Yeah.
JD Vance is very on the record about wanting to use state power to further conservative social ends. And so I'm not even making a comment about what social ends I am partial to.
Sure.
I just don't believe in employing the coercive means of the state to force people to live a certain way that we think that they should, or that he thinks that they should, or you think that or I, anybody else.
Right.
And so I'm a big concern that the right is becoming a lot more like progressives in the sense that they want to use the state to force people to live a certain way. They're just coming at it from the opposite end of the political spectrum. So those are my biggest concerns about the two sides right now.
No, well put, Ben. I share a lot of those concerns as well. And I've been writing a lot about what they call the quote unquote new right that's been coming out with folks like JD Vance. And just if you have the right people in charge, then they can make the decisions that you want. And, one thing that I think is interesting about this, Ben, is that let's say that was correct. Let's just assume that they're right, that we have the right people in charge and make these decisions and it all goes the way that we want it to, then that's correct. The problem is that those people aren't going to be in charge forever. So as soon as you give those people more power, the other side's going to come in and use that same power to go in the opposite direction. And I don't think they've thought this through very long, but it makes good politics and it's good populism in their rhetoric. But longer term, the policies are bound to fail, don't you think?
Yeah, that's very well put. To vastly expand the size and scope of government and expand its powers, oftentimes past the limits of the Constitution. We really grade those lines of what the boundaries are.
Definitely.
For centuries, in a sense, over time. It's very short-sighted to believe that we just need to give our guy, right? To have the thought of let's give our guy so much power and everything will be okay. As you just stated, someone from the other side of the spectrum will get elected at some point. Yeah. And now they have these huge levers of power that they can just use in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
And a deeper thing that I want listeners to consider is not giving someone that we think is good power, right? We need to think about the structure of the power in the United States. Milton Friedman, which I know you and I talked about Milton Friedman before we got on this show and during this episode. Yeah. He has a wonderful quote about how we're not going to fix the state of things in this country by electing the right people, right? He says we've already tried that. The problem is that once elected in office, the right people become the wrong people.
Yeah.
The problem is there's not a good incentive structure for them to act correctly. And so another reason why I love political commentary is because Milton Friedman stated that we need to create a political climate of opinion that makes it profitable for the wrong people to do the right thing. Because if we don't, then the right people won't do the right thing either.
Yep.
And so I think it's really important that we dive deeply into some of these issues so that we can create that beneficial political climate.
Yeah. Amen. Well put there, Ben. Yeah, well put there. I think one of the research issues that I've worked on for a number of years is just the importance of institutions, that framework being in institutions. And of course, Pete Boettke is always big into this and mainline economics and everything else. And I think it's right on. We've got to have the institutional framework. That's why free market capitalism is so important. Our republic is so important, to have limited government that sets the rules of the game, but then we work within that rules of the game, where the government should be a referee, get out of the playing of the game. Too often they want to be in the middle of the game, whether it's from the left or the right. And I think you put this well, and I think this will bring us nicely into your book about Beyond Intention. And you put here the subtitle, How Progressive Economic Policy Initiatives Would Harm Society's Most Vulnerable. I wonder, just to get this started here on the book issues, Ben, is when you wrote this book, did you have progressive economic policy in mind from the left and the right, or was it more so from the left? Because I agree with what you said earlier. To me, a lot of the quote unquote new right is really the old progressives. This is really FDR and LBJ and, larger labor unions and more government spending, higher taxes. It seems to me that we've got a problem from the left to the right. and so I wonder what some of your thinking was. Was it mostly for the left, or was it really across the political spectrum?
Yeah, that's really well put about what the new right has become. So the book itself is about left-wing policies. Just to rattle off I only focus on 5. It's a very short book for a reason. I know people aren't necessarily inclined to pick up long economics books if they don't have a passion for it. So it's a little over 100 pages. It's very small dimensions. So I focus on 5 policies: raising the minimum wage, implementing rent control, tuition-free college, universal health care, and a wealth tax. Those are all very left-wing positions. I have thought about doing a similar book, but on what are now thought to be right-wing economic policies, and about how some of those policies would harm society's most vulnerable. Just the one that really comes to mind right now is the talk about really stepping away from free trade. I think that's a really important discussion to have. But this book is focused on left-wing policies, and specifically how I do think that at least the voters, right? We could say the bureaucrats should know better. They want power, probably. The politicians oftentimes just want more power, or they're playing to people's emotions, even though they know better about the effects of these policies. I think the voters have good intentions, generally speaking. So that's why the book is called Beyond Intention, because I want to debate or analyze in good faith. Right. I think we demonize people who disagree with us far too often. And I don't want to demonize progressive voters. I just want to have the discussion about how the policies they support would harm the very people that they are trying to help with them.
Yeah, and you do a great job of that in the book, and I'll make sure to put a link to this in the show notes page for the audience to go and get a copy. And I liked, of course, the Beyond Intention, because as our discussion about Milton Friedman, it always goes back to his quote that reminds me of, don't judge a policy by their intentions, but by their results. Right. And I think that's what you've done a great job here of looking at some of the pros and cons. But at the end of the day, here's where it's going. So let's kind of go through each one of these, though. Let's kind of take a deeper dive. I don't think I've done that as much within my show and my previous guests. So I think this will be really good. But what about with the minimum wage, right? So we have the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, put in the first federal minimum wage anyway at 25 cents an hour. And it was right during the Great Depression and FDR's expansion of government and everything. And, a lot of the push at that time seemed to be that employers were taking advantage of their workers and they needed some sort of minimum wage so they could push back. And of course, that's changed over time. The last time it was raised was in 2009, up to $7.25 an hour, where it currently is the federal level. But a lot of states are now well above that. I mean, California, New York, I think are going up to $20 an hour for some workers here pretty soon. In Texas, where I'm at, Texas is one of the few states that still follows the federal minimum wage. So it's still $7.25. But I wonder, kind of in your discussion and your thoughts on the minimum wage, I'd love to hear your perspective on it and how you like to explain it to maybe some of your friends and others and family.
Yeah, and one of the things I tried to impart upon my readers in this book is using very basic economic principles to evaluate various policies. I think that if we can grasp the basic principles of economics, all of the noise starts to go away. And it becomes so much easier to evaluate the policies that we hear. And so for the minimum wage, it's simple, again, basic principles, supply and demand, right? That's really what we need to understand to evaluate the minimum wage. If you artificially increase the price of something, you're going to reduce demand for it, right? You're going to have a surplus of supply. It's the same as a good or service. It's the same for workers. If I artificially increase the price of labor through a minimum wage law, I'm going to reduce demand for labor compared to what it otherwise would be, assuming that it's a meaningful job. Like, let's say there was no, if there was no law right now, and then they said there's going to be a 25-cent minimum wage in 2024, that's probably not going to have much effect at all because no one's working for 25 cents in the United States. Right. And no one would. Even if there was no law, the minimum wage does not determine how much low-wage workers make. Supply and demand does. Yep. And so if we artificially raise the price of wages, we're going to reduce demand, and you're going to have greater unemployment or lower earnings and also higher prices than we otherwise would be. So the earnings and higher prices come from individuals might see their hours cut, right? Yeah. We might see companies increase their prices to try and offset the increased labor costs, which makes things more expensive for people.
And real quick, Ben, because you said demand, but really I think you mean quantity demanded, because we're just moving up along the curve, right? Yes. And at the same time as you artificially raise that price, being the wage, you also get an incentive for people to work more hours oftentimes. So the quantity supplied increases at the same time, which gives you that gap. The surplus, quote unquote surplus, which is the unemployment, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's a very good way to break it down. And so the problem that we see is a lot of individuals support the minimum wage because they want to raise wages for people, right? Yeah. I think it's a great intention. They want to see people prosper more. The problem is that if you do that, you're going to see people's hours cut. You're going to see job losses. You're going to see prices rise. And who does that harm? That harms the least skilled workers, because if I increase the price of their labor to a point that is far above their productivity, it's going to be very hard for them to find or keep a job. And so the lower skilled workers and the most inexperienced workers who need that entry level job, right, to maybe work themselves up the ladder, those rungs of the ladder are going to be cut in a sense. And so we harm the most inexperienced and then the least skilled workers, who are also typically paid the least amount. So they're already the most vulnerable. Yep. So some people will see a pay bump, right, if they're lucky enough to keep their jobs. But the most vulnerable, the ones that we really want to help the most, are the ones who are harmed the most by such a policy. And there are in the book, in the chapter, I provide plenty of empirical studies. There's studies from Seattle. After Seattle raised their minimum wage, there were around 5,000 fewer low-wage jobs than there otherwise would have been following their second increase in the minimum wage. There's comparisons of a retailer that has stores in California and in Texas. California raised their minimum wage tons. And then in Texas, they didn't have increases in the minimum wage over the period it was studied. There were very clear negative effects for workers in California as compared to in Texas. So it's really important to understand these are real world effects. They truly harm the most vulnerable among us. Yeah. And a great way to stress test this idea is to look at the original intentions of minimum wage laws. Thomas Sowell is an amazing economist and philosopher, historian, all kinds of titles. That guy wears lots of hats. He wrote a great article, Why Racists Love Minimum Wage Laws, in the New York Post. He went through the history from Canada He also talked about South Africa, these different, and in the United States, where individuals wanted to increase minimum wage laws as a way to price out workers of races and ethnicities that there was a lot of prejudice against, right? Because if I increase the cost of labor, whether it's, you could see the lowest skilled go first. Some employers also had biases against different racial groups. And so those racial groups were the ones who were first to go when labor costs rose. And so the ill effects of minimum wage laws have been well known for decades and over a century. But I think that we get lost, progressives specifically, get lost in their intentions. Yeah, no, definitely. Well said. And I think something else that is often overlooked, well, a couple of things. One, with the minimum wage, I mean, it's 3% of the population even earn the minimum wage. So it's a very small percentage. And most people will say, well, it's how can a family or a mother or single mother help put food on the table and everything else with the minimum wage? Well, that's not really what's happening in most situations. What is it? About 55% of those earning the minimum wage are between the ages of 16 to 24. So they're younger, they're getting their foot in the door. They usually have other sources of income like their parents or student loans or something else that's going on. And so, they like to throw out these pictures of the worst case scenarios, but that's few and far between who are actually on the minimum wage. They're just trying to get their foot in the door to move up the income ladder. The other thing that's important, I think, to understand here is, and you were right about low skilled workers. Well, remember that there's not one labor market. There are low skilled, mid skilled, high skilled, and everywhere in between. So really those minimum wage workers are the ones that are only competing with low skills. They don't really compete with mid skilled and high skilled workers. And so you're automatically going to focus in on that particular group. And what's interesting is that over time, what does that do? That has a different price between capital and labor. So when you raise the price of labor, you relatively price down or reduce the price of capital, relatively speaking, and that incentivizes businesses and employers to do what? Get more kiosks, get more automation, technology, and things of that nature. And what I like to bring up, and I used to teach about this a lot in my classes, I always got excited about it, is that, let's say you raise the minimum wage. You look at McDonald's and you want to raise their pay. Well, what happens oftentimes is they'll get rid of their cashier and they'll put a kiosk in place. Well, who makes the kiosk? It's the high skilled workers. Who maintains the kiosk? The mid skilled workers. So really what you've done is you've reduced demand for the low skilled workers and you've raised the demand for the mid skilled and high skilled workers. And so some have argued that you need a minimum wage to reduce income inequality, when a lot of the research is actually showing that it raises income inequality because of the distortions that it puts in the marketplace. So it's just it's a terrible policy, and I'm glad that you put it first, because there's so much misunderstanding, misperceptions about what the minimum wage is. Yeah, no, that was all really important. It's in a sense, it's a wealth transfer from the most vulnerable to the less vulnerable individuals in the marketplace, in the labor markets. And I think one thing that I want to stress is that this doesn't mean nothing can be done to improve the opportunities, of individuals in the labor markets. One of the sections in each chapter of this book is an alternative solutions section, where I look at, I just in a sense, I just really attacked, this proposed solution, raising the minimum wage. A lot of people will look at that and say, okay, great. What's your solution then, right? And so I think it's important that we do talk about, there are other ways to help individuals in maintaining or obtaining greater levels of prosperity. And you hit the nail on the head when you pointed out that very few people make the federal minimum wage. In 2021, 98% of the 76 million wage-based workers made more than the federal minimum wage, right? Okay. So it's not a large percentage of people who are making that $7.25 an hour. But what we do know is that there is a stack of papers, right, with tons of unnecessary government regulations on business, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not here to say that all regulation is unnecessary. I'm not here to tell listeners that we need to reject every proposed regulation ever, right? That's not the discussion I want to get into. Yeah. The point is that we can agree that there is a number of very unnecessary, harmful, and regressive regulations on business that are typically meant to protect incumbents against competitors by raising the cost of entry into various fields, right? And at the same time, what regulations do is they increase costs on incumbents as well. They're right; they can take on those costs, and new startups or individuals looking to innovate, it's harder for them. But raising costs for incumbents also typically tends to raise the prices of their goods and services, and that makes things less affordable. It also makes it harder for businesses to grow, which reduces job growth. It reduces wage growth as a result because it reduces the demand. We end up in a state of lower quantity demanded than we otherwise would, right? It's kind of a counterfactual thought process here. So that's one issue. Another issue is licensing, right? Occupational licensing is out of control. Occupational licensing has increased, around sixfold in the last 50, 60 years to where now around 30% of occupations in the United States require a license to practice it. And there are plenty of ridiculous ones like florists, interior designers, trash haulers, barbers. Do a lot of these occupations really need legal licenses that require paperwork, hours, fees, right? They increase the cost of doing business. Do we really need all these barriers? I would argue that the answer is no. And so my proposed alternative solution would be rolling back a lot of this red tape to allow people to employ their own skills and own capital in ways that they see fit to try to improve their own lives.
No, exactly. Having more liberty brings about more prosperity. We need more of that for sure. Well, we could go on and on about that because there's so much within the minimum wage, but I think it's really important for us to focus a little bit more on that. And then I want to get into some of these other ones as well, just because of the market dynamics. I think we've been able to explain some of the market dynamics between supply and demand. Minimum wage is a price floor that's set above the equilibrium wage and therefore creates this surplus of unemployment that doesn't allow you to get to that equilibrium wage in the marketplace. The next one in your book, though, is more about a price ceiling that keeps the price below the equilibrium wage, and that is through rent control. So, Ben, are you for people being homeless and not being able to afford their home? Why do you care about rent control?
That's the dichotomy we're often served is either you support rent control, you don't care about people who are struggling with housing costs. Obviously, as you know, since you read the book, it's a dichotomy I absolutely reject.
Yes. Rightfully so, by the way. But go on.
Yes. Thank you. The rent control is an utterly destructive policy that it's actually one of those policies that even certain leftists will recognize is destructive, right? Assar Lindbeck, to give an example, was a Swedish economist. He was what was known as a social democrat. He once said that rent control was the most efficient technique presently known to destroy a city except for bombing, right? So I don't think that a lot of progressives today understand that fact, right? So there's a lot of progressive voters who don't quite understand that, but this is a policy that where even some leftists or people who are very far on the left side of the political spectrum will recognize it's a detrimental policy. So rent control places a cap on rent prices. And so when you place a cap on a good or service, right, that's lower than what it otherwise would be if we had free-flowing market prices, what you do is you do a couple of things, right? You do increase demand for it, and you also vastly reduce the incentive to create that product, right? So if there's when prices rise, it signals to individuals in the market that there are potential profits to be made in that area. Right. So let's take housing as that example. If housing is very expensive and say profit margins are really beautiful and great, that is a blinking light to developers, to investors, to try to create housing to capture a slice of those potential profits. But what then happens, right? If more supply comes online, you end up reducing the price of housing in the long run. If you increase the supply of housing relative to the demand of it, then you're going to see prices moderate over time. The issue is that if we reduce artificially the price with a rent control cap, all of a sudden I'm disincentivizing new development. So we're going to have a shortage of supply. I'm increasing demand at the same time I'm reducing the level of supply that we otherwise would see. So that it creates huge shortage problems. You see people start, people who can afford housing already, they might rent out a second place, right? If they can afford this already. And so they might keep it vacant. But the fact of the matter is that you're going to see less housing for people who actually need it.
Yeah.
And then current housing is going to deteriorate to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Because landlords and property management companies and services, they're not going to be able to afford all of the same upkeep services at the artificially reduced rent prices, let's say, that they otherwise would be able to provide. So you start seeing deteriorating housing. And in the book, again, I won't go through them this time, but in the book, I go through a ton of empirical examples that we've seen throughout history. So I like to go through the principles first. I then give the real world examples. And then in each chapter, I say, hey, what do we do about this instead? But those are the basic principles about what happens when you cap rents.
Yeah, Ben, that's fantastic. And I think you hit on a lot of the key points there already about the reduction in the quantity demanded, the increase in the quantity demanded because now the rent price is lower, the reduction in the quantity supplied. Again, you have the gap. It's a shortage gap, which also creates lines and rationing that takes place in housing, which is bad for the people that you're trying to help. At the same time, you get, kind of this slums, if you will, in other places because of the rent controls. And so the quality of those housing goes down as well. And so it's bad, again, for the beyond intentions. It goes against the people that we are intended to help in the process. And so it's well put, and it's well put in the book as well. In just a few more minutes that we have together, so we can wrap up here. I'd love to go through all the next three in a lot of detail. We're not going to have time to do that today, but that'll be good reason for the audience to go out and get the book, read it. Yes. It's a lot of good information. But we have tuition-free college, universal health care, and the wealth tax. What would you say about each one of those, and just a brief overview or your synopsis of it for the audience?
Yeah. So I'll try and keep these short. So for tuition-free college, obviously individuals are taking out loans at very, tons of college students are needing loans to go to college, right? And the college debt crisis we hear about all the time, it might not quite be the crisis that politicians like to say it is. However, it is a burden on young people, right? Yeah. And it creates all sorts of bad consequences. But we need to understand, why is college so expensive in the first place?
Right.
And the problem is that the government over the last few decades has become increasingly generous in handing out larger and larger loans and grants to students to go to universities. And as a result, if I'm a university and I'm going to get paid anyway, I might as well get paid some more. And so that vastly increases upward pressure, or places great upward pressure on prices and tuition, right? And so it just continues to spiral. It becomes more affordable, so we need larger loans. And then it becomes more unaffordable. And then it becomes more unaffordable, larger loans. And you just keep going up and up and up in this poor spiraling cycle. And then we hit a debt crisis, right, for young people. And so the question is, what do we do about it? And some say, okay, cancel student debt or make colleges tuition free, and that just creates all sorts of poor incentives. I don't want to go through all of them, just a few are you're going to have a very high number of students compared to resources. So the resources per student are going to decline. So you're going to have lower quality education, even for the vulnerable people who now have the opportunity to get in there. As a result, too, when we look at other countries, tuition-free college actually does not, in a broad sense, vastly increase the number of, let's say, poor or low educated individuals going to higher education, because it still entails costs. You still have housing costs. You have foregone income that you could have made working as opposed to going to universities. So it creates a poor incentive. People won't look at trade schools as much. Community college will be an afterthought, right? And so individuals will waste more time going to college when they otherwise shouldn't. 33% of workers are underemployed, meaning they work a job that typically doesn't require a college degree. So a lot of people who are already going to college shouldn't be, per se.
Yep.
So anyway, there's a lot more I could say, but I'll move on.
I think a kind of bottom line, go back to Friedman, is nothing is free, right? The tuition-free college is not free. There's rationing. There's all the other stuff that you just mentioned. So I think that's well put there. Okay, so the next one, universal health care. That's a big push that's out there. Some have even said Medicare for all. Kamala Harris has talked about that some. But what are some of the big points that you make to shut that down?
Yeah. Universal healthcare is a very hot button issue. And just like tuition-free college, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right?
Yeah.
And so they have to be paid for somehow. And how are they going to be paid for? They're going to be paid for by taxes. They're going to be paid for either taxes now or taxes delayed to future generations. Or for now, if we're going to delay them, we could take on debt. So that is, banks, financial institutions, individual investors like you and me and listeners can buy government debt. Or the Federal Reserve can increase the money supply and buy the government debt itself, right? Yeah. So we can do inflation, we can crowd out private investment, or we can tax Americans.
Yeah.
3 not good outcomes if we really care about people's prosperity. It weighs on economic growth. So tuition-free college and free healthcare both do that.
Yeah.
Okay. So healthcare is a huge burden on families, right? That's I totally understand the desire for free healthcare.
Sure.
And it's also easy to feel that we don't. It's very uncomfortable to think that someone who's sick or is hurting is going to forego medical treatment because of cost. And every year Americans do that. It's deeply upsetting in a sense that is the reality. But that doesn't mean it should be free, right? It doesn't mean that taxpayers or debtors or the Federal Reserve should be putting money towards this because of all the ill effects it would have. Again, we need to understand, why is healthcare so expensive? And it's because of a few reasons: overregulation through Obamacare, or certificate of need laws that prevent a proliferation of hospitals or other medical institutions or facilities. Again, I don't want to go into detail because I know we're running out of time. But I would highly recommend people read the book to learn about the third-party payer system if they're really interested in healthcare. That would take me, multiple minutes to really dive into. So I'll skip over that. But the FDA, certificate of need laws, the third-party payer system, all of these things, what they do is they either reduce supply, which puts upward pressure on prices. They either create poor incentives by having third parties, in a sense, pay. Again, if you're an institution, you're going to get paid. You might as well get paid some more. So in a sense, it increases pressure on prices. And again, there's a lot more I could say about this, but those are the main issues. The reason why free college is not a solution is because, again, we would have to spend around $3 trillion a year on that. To give listeners an idea, federal expenditures are around 6-7 trillion every year. So that's a huge increase.
Yeah, you mean for a free healthcare.
For free healthcare. Adding on 3 trillion. The cost of free healthcare would be enormous. And so again, crowds out private investment, increased taxes also will take capital out of the private economy, or inflation. The Federal Reserve can create new money to buy the debt. So all three harm the most vulnerable. And then that's not even talking about what it would do to the quality of healthcare. Quality of healthcare would go down. We would also, or Michael F. Cannon at the Cato Institute has written about this extensively. I cite him a lot in the book.
He's been a guest. He's been a guest on the show too.
You have had so many great guests and so many people I've cited in this book. I talk about in the book how it would reduce the quality and, again, reduce the quantity of it. Because if in a sense, if doctors have less freedom, if doctors can't necessarily make good money on this or whatever, right? There's a ton of ill consequences from free healthcare. You're going to see lower quality and reduced efficiency and reduced supply. So it really harms sick people because they can't get in to see specialists. They can't get in to get surgeries. Canadians come to the United States for care for this reason. We see people in the UK where there's massive wait times. They come to other countries to get healthcare. So that's why free healthcare is not a solution. And then the alternative solution is, hey guys, let's actually deregulate.
Yeah.
Let's roll back the red tape that caused these problems in the first place.
Let markets work. You know what I mean? To let people prosper. You know, all these things that you're mentioning right now and that we're talking about it keeps solidifying the case that government is the problem. You know, we look at these solutions from government, but it's difficult or impossible, in my view, to solve government failure with more government. You're just going to continue to make the problem worse. You've got to get government out of the way. And then the last one, is on your wealth tax as a way maybe to pay for some of this stuff, as some would argue. But of course, that's a bad idea, right? Because you're going to make even more problems, especially for the most vulnerable, as a lot of those more wealthy people are the ones that create the jobs and pay the workers and everything else. And so you create this downward spiral of all these things together. Just to wrap up here, this has been a great conversation, Ben. I hate to cut us off, and we should have you back on. Now we can go through these in more detail here soon. But with all of this that's there and the concerns that are out there and the election and everything else, why are you still optimistic about the future and that there are ways that we still can let people prosper?
I'm optimistic because, in a sense, it's in the title of my book. It's because I think individuals have good intentions.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes it's hard to get people to change their beliefs because it becomes a sort of identity for them. They identify with progressive causes. Their friends are progressives. They vote for progressives. They go to their rallies. They donate to them, right? It can become a large part of your identity. So it can become really hard to part with these beliefs. But I'm optimistic because I think that individuals have good intentions. And so I think that a large share of Americans are open to free market ideas if we can get the messaging right. And so this book is an attempt for me to do that. It's a short book, a little over 100 pages, lots of citations, which are at the end of each chapter. So you feel really good. You get to that citation page and you go, wow, there's 4 pages of citations. I'm getting deeper into the book than I thought.
Yeah.
And I try and lay it out simply: principles, empirical data, alternative solutions, or if it's a problem like high healthcare costs or high tuition, it's okay, why is it this way in the first place? Why does the progressive solution, why would it harm people? And then what's the alternative? Just to wrap up, I want to wrap up this thought. I want to just state that there's 3 flaws I found when I wrote this book, 3 themes for progressive policies. I think they often identify a real issue, right? Workers might have trouble. They're not making high wages in certain instances, right? Housing can be a large burden, and it is. There is data that shows housing is a huge burden in lots of areas. Listeners, if you read the book, it's because of government intervention.
Yeah.
But so there, housing, healthcare, free tuition, those are all major problems. Wealth tax, I don't think comes from a real problem, as readers will see. I don't think wealth inequality in and of itself is an issue. The issue is, how did it come about?
Yeah.
If it came about in a bad way, that's different. But if it's natural, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. But progressives are good at identifying issues. The problem is their solutions tend to reject basic economic principles because, this is the third thing, because they don't truly understand what caused the issue that they have identified in the first place. And so we need to, if we recognize an issue, we need to do our diligence and learn what's causing it. And then we can suggest policies that actually get to the root and the heart of that issue. And to do so, we have to do a little bit of learning about basic economic principles. But after going through a few policies, they start to come naturally.
Yeah. No, great words there, Ben. And the book, again, for the audience, is Beyond Intention: How Progressive Economic Policy Initiatives Would Harm Society's Most Vulnerable. There's a lot of key insights in there that we've discussed today, some additional ones as well. We're going to leave you guessing some, so we're going to have to cover everything here. But Ben, thank you for all your work. Good luck with all your endeavors, and God bless you and your family.
Vance, you as well. Same to you and your family, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you. It's really been a pleasure. For the audience, if you enjoyed our discussion, go out and share this with your friends and family. Give us a 5-star rating, and be sure to subscribe. You can find all this information at vanceginn.com or my show notes page, which is my newsletter, at vanceginn.substack.com. You can get this right in your inbox. And so until next time, let people prosper.